But unlike Frege, Russell actually made the explicit step after he'd done all this work to general philosophy,
Yes.
didn't he? Not until he was 40 years old, but then he did. And he started producing general works of philosophy. Can you give us some indication of what position
Well,
he
it's very odd
took up?
how little the two are connected. They, the one place where I suppose they are connected is something that Russell called the theory of descriptions. There was a puzzle about the meaning of statements like the present King of France, which didn't denote anything.
What if you say the present King of France is bald?
Exactly.
There is no King of France.
Yeah, and therefore, and didn't know anything, and therefore there was a question how it could be meaningful. And there had been philosophers. A notable example is a German called Meinong, who then thought that these things denoted what he called subsistent entities, and Russell thought this was rubbish, and he showed a way of translating out such expressions by showing that they, in fact, contained covert existence claims. Getting past is bald, which translated into there is one thing that now rules over France, and whatever it is that rules over France is bald, roughly. And this got rid of the apparent paradox. And so in that way, his logical work had a philosophical implication. But in the main, he simply went off on another tack. His first purely philosophical book came out in 1912. It's called The Problems of Philosophy. It's a Home University Library book. And in my view, still the best introduction to philosophy that there is, because Russell's such a marvelous writer, though it's a little bit old-fashioned. And there, he really takes no account of his logical work at all. He simply continues the British empiricist tradition. This is a book that follows straight on from Berkeley, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and it starts off with the theory of perception. It's very like Berkeley there. It says that what we perceive are not tables and chairs and things, but what Locke called simple ideas, what Russell, following his friend Moore, called sense data, and then...
These are the sensoria.
The philosophical question, how on the basis of being presented with these sense impressions do we arrive at physical objects? And then he deals with a set of traditional philosophical problems in that sort of way. And he more or less gave up logic after Principia Mathematica. He himself said that this wore him out. He collaborated on the book with Whitehead, but Whitehead was teaching mathematics at Cambridge and mainly occupied with that. Russell at that time was living independently. Well, he had a lectureship at Cambridge from 1910 to 1915, but in the first decade of this century he was living on his independent income, and so he had the actual work of writing out all these proofs. And he said that this really incapacitated him for ever doing any detailed work in future. And this is to some extent true. All his later work is full of brilliant ideas that he never fully works out. At a certain point he gets bored. He says, oh yes, it goes on like this. He doesn't bother to dot the I's and cross the true of all his later work.
I think that I see one very important continuing concern in the later work. I'd be interested to know if you agree with this or not. You've just said, I'm sure rightly, that Russell was a radical empiricist in the direct tradition of Locke and Hume. It seems to me that Russell was always concerned to validate the natural sciences in terms of sense data, that he always wanted to show that the whole corpus of our scientific knowledge could be derived from, and was derived from, nothing but observations and our reflections on our observations.
Well, not always. I think you make one very important point here, and one, in fact, that I overlooked when I was talking a few moments ago, and that is that from the very beginning, Russell's approach to philosophy was an interest in justification. There's quite an amusing story that when he was about 12, his elder brother, who was sent to school, Russell was taught at home, the elder brother, Frank, was sent to school, taught Russell geometry, and Russell refused to accept the axioms. He wanted to have them proved, and his brother said that they couldn't get on unless Russell accepted the axioms, so he agreed to provisionally. But he always wanted to have everything justified. And this was common both in his approach to logic and mathematics and in his approach to other branches of knowledge, and as you say, also in his approach to science. He wanted to have a basis for our belief in science. But here his views varied. In the book I mentioned, Problems of Philosophy, it's quite true that he wanted to start with sense data, but he didn't think that all scientific or even all common sense statements like that at the table, could be reduced to sensory statements. He adopted a causal theory that you could assume the existence of the physical world as the best explanation for our sensory experiences. Then he changed his view, and in the next important book that he published on the theory of knowledge, which was Our Knowledge of the External World, which came out in 1914, he did take the view you just referred to, namely he thought you could actually reduce not only every common sense statement, but every scientific statement to statements about our actual and possible hypothetical sense experiences. And this view, which is technically known as phenomenalism, was the view of Berkeley, if you rob Berkeley of God, and also the view of John Stuart Mill, who was incidentally Russell's godfather, lay godfather, because Russell's
believe in God.
and John Stuart Mill didn't believe in God, but he's lay godfather. This phenomenalistic view was developed in Our Knowledge of the External World, and also in some important essays that Russell wrote in a book called Mysticism and Logic, which he produced during the First World War. An essay called something like Sense Data and Physics is the most important one there. And he continued this in another important book called The Analysis of Mind, which came out, I think, in 1921, and he adopted a theory which had been advanced before him by the pragmatist William James, Henry James's elder brother, in which both mind and matter were composed of what James called neutral stuff, and which were in fact sense data and images, and they differed only in being different arrangements of these fundamental data. But then Russell gave this up, and in 1925, 1925 is a curious book, Analysis of Matter, where there are traces of this view still remaining, but he mainly went back to the causal theory that he'd held in 1912. And when he revived his interest in philosophy in the 1940s, and in his final, or his next to last, philosophical book, Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits, he goes back to a causal theory. He always thought that the basis of our knowledge lay in sense experience, but he varied in the next step. I mean, it was only during one period of his work that he thought that the whole thing could be reduced to sensory terms. More often, and certainly at the end of his life very vehemently, he adhered to the causal theory, which put the physical world beyond the veil of observation. In fact, he ended up with a very curious...
is the attempt to bring a wholly new rigour to bear in philosophy, not only of a logical kind, but one's tempted to say of a scientific kind. He was always very concerned, for example, that our beliefs should relate to the evidence for them. This is something he reiterated over and over again, isn't it? And it's something which, if taken seriously, sweeps aside a great deal of traditional philosophizing and traditional thinking.
Oh, yes, that I think is true. And I think that this, you already mentioned that Russell had an influence on Wittgenstein, and indeed Wittgenstein was Russell's pupil. And as you know, Wittgenstein and also that group of philosophers in Vienna called the Vienna Circle condemned what they call metaphysics. And metaphysics, in their view, was consisted, at least partly, in any attempt to describe the world in non-scientific terms. They thought that this was the only world there is, and that science was a matter of forming theories about it, which were verified by observation, and any assumption that there was a superior world, a world inhabited by gods or anything of that sort, was nonsensical. And Russell certainly all the time held this, and was always concerned to justify science, and was always worried by the fact he thought the justification for science was extremely problematic.
Yes,
I mean,
and it remained problematic to the end.
To the end, I mean, and it's very interesting, in the last book that he wrote, or at least the last book he wrote was a book, he then sets out what he thinks are the set of assumptions that require to be made if belief in scientific theories is to be justified, and makes it quite clear. Do you think these assumptions must, as it were, be taken on faith?
Yes.
And he tried to work out what we call a theory of induction, but was never entirely satisfied with it, and more or less said, well, I remember what he said. He said that we really can't be sure that science is true, but it has a greater chance of being true than anything else that can be set up as its rival.
Yes.